All right, so we're back again, and this is the supplement to lesson number 2, where we're going through the creation account. And in the first part of this lesson, we covered days 1, 2, and 3. Now we're going to do days 4, 5, and 6. So on day 4, God forms the sun, the moon, and the stars, right? And we're going to read in Genesis 1:14. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. Then God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the 4th day. So before we move into, if you remember from the last lesson, the last video, we talked about how there's this apparent contradiction between days 1 and 4, where God created light on day 1, but he didn't create the sun as the source of light until day 4. But let's talk about the purpose of the lights in the firmament of the heavens. The first thing is that they help keep time, right? A day is when the earth rotates on its own axis. One full rotation would be day and night. A month is when the moon rotates around the earth, right? That's a month. And then a year is, if we have the earth and we have the sun, a year is when the earth makes one complete orbit around the sun itself, right? So the sun, the moon, and the stars and the position of the earth and their relative movements help us keep time. The second thing, and we talked about this in the introduction, where it says that the lights in the sky are for signs and symbols. We pointed out that the word signs, a sign is a symbol. It's a metaphor that points to a bigger or a larger meaning. And by this, Moses is actually referring to the constellations, to the Mazzaroth. And the word Mazzaroth is it's a Hebrew word for zodiac. That's actually what it is, and it refers to the different constellations that tell the story of God day after day, month after month. So if you remember last video, I asked you to read Job 38, where Job is complaining to God. God basically says, "Sit down and listen to me. I'm going to talk to you. You're going to answer me back." God proceeds to list all the things that he did in the creation. And in Job 38:31, he says this, and notice all the references to constellations. He says, "Can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades, or loose the belt of Orion? Can you bring out Mazzaroth in its season?" And he's talking now about the zodiac constellations. "Or can you guide the Great Bear with its own clubs?" And that would be, the Great Bear would be, I believe, the Big Dipper. "Do you know that the ordinances of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth?" So what God is talking about here is, again, he's talking about the Mazzaroth, the zodiac, the constellations. And so clearly the constellations themselves are not of pagan origin, as many Christians fear. And I believe that you need to be comfortable with the biblical fact that God made the stars and he wrote his story within the constellations. The constellations are not pagan. It's this idea that you can look at the stars and determine your horoscope or your fate. Really, the stars tell the story of God. They don't tell the story of you or of us, right? That's not what God is saying. But we see very clearly in the Old Testament these references to constellations that we know today, right? Pleiades, the Orion belt, and Mazzaroth, referring to the entire thing. So that's the signs, right? We understand that God put all the stuff up there to tell the story. He embedded it in creation well ahead of time in terms of prophecy. Then we talked about the word seasons and how it doesn't refer to summer and winter. The main reason is the definition of the Greek and Hebrew actually is appointed times or occasions, and this refers to God's feast days that he gave his people much later, about, again, 2,500 years later, when Moses took the Jews out of Egypt, out of bondage, and they made a covenant with God. He said, "Listen, I want you to start observing these feast days." Well, those feast days were kind of foretold in the creation, right? They were there to mark the beginning and the end of the feast days. And we'll come to that again when we get to the appropriate story. But we also know that there were no seasons until the flood in about the year 1651 after creation. And we're going to cover that in a couple of weeks. But when Noah gets off the ark, it refers specifically to, hey, now you've got seasons, right? So we know from the day of creation up until Noah comes off the ark, there were no seasons. And what that means is that prior to the flood, the earth was not tilted in its axis. As you remember in the introduction, we talked about the ecliptic, where the north-south orientation is not, vertical, if you will, but it's tilted 23.5 degrees, and it's the tilt as the earth spins and then rotates around the sun that actually creates summer and winter and spring and fall. So let me get to this apparent contradiction between day 4 and day 1. And I say apparent contradiction because anything that seems like a contradiction is a problem with our understanding and not with the Bible's accuracy and credibility. So how do we solve this potential conflict where God's word says that light was created on day 1, but the sun wasn't created until day 4? Right? And you and I consider the sun to be the source of light that defines day and night, which is how day 1 is described. And, honestly, it's a simple solution. But let me tell you how others try to resolve this. The first is to ignore it and just simply claim divine miracle. It's a divine mystery, right? Only God knows, right? And this is no different than believing that, the Son of God is fully God and fully human, what's called the hypostatic union. Just kind of brush it off and move along. Nothing to see here. It's a divine mystery. So that's one way that people deal with it. Now, others say that God created the concept or the principle of light and makes the distinction that while the sun gives light, the sun is not light itself, and that is absolutely true. But the day 1 creation account clearly shows the earth spinning on its axis and a cycle of light and dark from the perspective of the earth. And that demands that whatever the light was on day 1 was coming from a fixed point or source, so that during part of the day, part of the earth was in darkness and the other part was in light, right? Day and night. So saying that on day 1, God created light as a concept or as a principle, and then hung the sun as a source of light on day 4 really doesn't cut it, because clearly there was a source point from the perspective of the earth that cast shadow on one side and light on the other. Now, here's what I believe to be the answer. And I'm going to be totally transparent with you and tell you that this just occurred to me a few days ago as I kept going over and over the account of day 1. In fact, I literally spent about 2 days studying only the first 5 verses of the book of Genesis chapter 1, like verse 1 to 5. I spent 2 days just looking at those 5 verses. The answer lies in understanding that Jesus is the light of the world, and not simply from a knowledge of God standpoint, because in the New Testament, we talked about light as a metaphor for knowledge and understanding of God, but literally throughout the scriptures, Old Testament and New, Jesus is the source of light. He is, at one point, he's referred to as the shining one. So let me say this: the light that appeared on day 1 came from the Son of God himself. He was the source point. He was the illumination. He illuminated the entire universe, and his light, the light that came from him, defined day versus night. I want you to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Now, we've already read John 1, where the apostles talk about Jesus being the light of men. I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly. I'm not going to make major quotes, but I'm going to tell you where you can look these things up. In Exodus chapter 33, on Mount Sinai, Moses asked to see the pre-incarnate Christ's glory, and Jesus says, "Nobody can see my face and live." In Exodus 34, 29 to 35, Moses' face continued to shine after being in the presence of the pre-incarnate Christ on Mount Sinai while he was receiving the 10 Commandments and the covenants. In Isaiah 60, verse 19, when Isaiah describes the kingdom, he says, "There is no need for sun and the moon to give light in the kingdom because the glory of God is there." In Daniel chapter 2:21, Daniel praises God and says that he changes the times and seasons, and light dwells with him. In the Gospels, Jesus says that while he was on the earth, that he was the light of the world. In Hebrews 1, 1 through 4, Jesus is described as the brightness of the glory of the Father. And in 2 Peter 1:19, Jesus is called the morning star, and the Greek literally says he is the shining one. In Revelation 1:16, Jesus' face is described as being like the sun shining in its strength. And we could probably also, talk about the Mount of Transfiguration as well. In Acts chapter 22, when Saul or Paul was on the road to Damascus, I'm just going to read a few verses here. In verse 6, now it happened as I journeyed and came near Damascus at about noon, suddenly a great light from heaven shone around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. And those who were with me indeed saw the light, and they were afraid. Now, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, we're going to read in verse 6. And the God that Paul refers to here is the Father. For it is God the Father who commanded light to shine out of darkness, who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Now, this certainly could refer to the incarnation of the Son. Jesus came in the form of a man, and he was the light of men. But the language is very similar to the Genesis account, and the consistent theme of the Son being the source of light throughout the Old and New Testaments is absolutely undeniable. So I submit to you that there is no conflict between the day 1 creation account and the day 4 creation account. I submit that the Son of God was the source of light that divided day and night on day 1. And then on day 4, Jesus placed the sun at the center of our solar system to continue to shine on the earth and to define days and years and the actual seasons. And I think if you understand it this way, there is, again, no contradiction between days 1 and 4. From day 1 of creation, the light of God was shining on the earth. Metaphorically, then, the entire creation was bathed with the light and with the knowledge of God. Perhaps that's why Paul says in Romans that the pagans have no excuse because creation itself is a witness to the glory of God. So again, there is no conflict between day 1 and day 4, even when you take things literally. The problem is with our understanding rather than with the text and with the source material. So let's move on to day 5. Remember, now we're filling the containers, or God is filling the containers that he's made. And on day 5, he fills the atmosphere and the sea with fish and birds. Then God said, verse 20, then God said, let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth and across the face of the firmament of the heavens. So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. So the evening and the morning were the 5th day. Pretty easy, right? Move on to day 6. Then God said, and this is where God now fills the dry land with land animals and mankind. Then God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind. And please remember, all these references to its kind, it's talking about reproduction can only happen from kind and kind, right? You can't have two kinds reproducing. Cattle and creeping thing and the beast of the earth, each according to its kind, and it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the earth. And God said, see, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food. Also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food, and it was so. Then God saw everything that he had made. Indeed, it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Chapter 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So we're going to end there for now. When we meet next week, we're going to continue on through chapter 2, and then we're going to go back to day 6 creation, actually, and we're going to talk about God creating Adam and Eve, and then we're going to move forward. We'll talk about the generations and where Adam and Eve fell, and then the wicked and the faithful generations up until the time of Noah. So I hope you found this whole lesson as interesting as I have. Again, God bless you, and we'll see you back in fellowship. Take care.